There's a wagon in my grandfather's garage. It hasn't moved in maybe 15 years. The paint has gone from fire engine red to something closer to rust and memory. One wheel doesn't spin right anymore. And if you flip it over, there, stamped into the steel, so faint you'd need to run your thumb across it to be sure it's real. It says Radio Flyer, Chicago, Illinois. Not made in China, not assembled from imported components. Chicago, Illinois. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because somewhere in America right now, there's a kid pulling a brand new Radio Flyer wagon down a driveway. Same red, same shape, same logo, stamped in that same looping script that's barely changed since the 1930s. And that kid has no idea, none, that the wagon under his feet has almost nothing in common with the one in my grandfather's garage. Not the steel, not the hands that built it, not even the country. This is the story of how that happened. Not with a bankruptcy, not with a hostile takeover, or a corporate raider, or a villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom somewhere. That's what makes this one different, and honestly, harder to tell. Radio Flyer never collapsed. It's still here. Still family-owned, 4 generations deep. Still headquartered a few miles from where it all began. By most measures, it won. So why does it feel like something was lost? Stick with me. Because the story of the little red wagon isn't really about a wagon at all. It's about what happens when the thing that made a company great becomes the thing it can no longer afford to be. To understand what Radio Flyer lost, you first have to understand what it built. In 1914, a 16-year-old boy named Antonio Pasin got off a boat from Italy with almost nothing. His family had sold their mule to buy him passage to America. He was the son of a cabinet maker from a small town near Venice, and he carried that trade in his hands the way some men carry a name. He landed in Chicago, and like a lot of immigrants of that era, he took whatever work he could find, including, by some accounts, digging sewers, just to save enough money for a set of woodworking tools. By 1917, he'd rented a one-room workshop on the city's west side. He started building wooden wagons, by hand, one at a time. He called the company Liberty Coaster, a nod to the statue that had probably been one of the last things he saw before Ellis Island. And the wagons sold. Not slowly either, as fast as he could build them. Here's the part I love. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic, and the whole country lost its mind over it. Radio broadcasts were the other technological miracle of the moment. This invisible magic that could carry a human voice across an entire continent. Pasin, who by then had switched from wood to stamped steel construction, borrowing techniques and scrap metal from Chicago's booming auto industry, decided his wagon deserved a name that captured that same sense of wonder. He called it the Radio Flyer. Think about the audacity of that. A wagon, a child's toy, named after 2 of the most futuristic inventions of the 20th century. Pasin wasn't just building a product, he was selling a feeling. The feeling that anything was possible, that a kid in a red wagon could be a pilot, an explorer, an inventor, if he just used his imagination. And Americans bought it. Millions of them. By 1930, the company had been renamed Radio Steel and Manufacturing, and it was running Ford-style assembly lines out of a massive facility in the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood, churning out wagons at a pace that's honestly hard to believe. More than 1,000 a day, even in the depths of the Great Depression, when families had almost nothing left to spend. Think about that for a second. In the worst economic collapse in American history, people were still finding a way to buy their kids a radio flyer. That's not a toy company. That's a company that had figured out how to sell hope. When World War II came, Pasin did what a lot of American manufacturers did. He retooled. From 1942 to 1945, the plant that built little red wagons was building steel Blitz cans, the 5-gallon fuel containers that kept Allied tanks and jeeps moving. Steel was rationed. Toys were a luxury the war effort couldn't spare. So the company didn't complain. It adapted, served its purpose, and waited for peace. And when peace came, the baby boom happened. And it happened right into radio flyers' hands. Picture post-war America. New suburbs stretching out from every city, new driveways, new sidewalks, and a wave of children being born at a rate this country had never seen before or since. Every single one of those families, it seemed, eventually ended up with a little red wagon in the garage. It became something close to a rite of passage. Not just a purchase, a tradition, passed from one generation to the next. The way you'd pass down a family recipe or a piece of furniture. Antonio Pasin ran the company well into his 70s. When his son Mario took over, he expanded the lineup. Wheelbarrows, garden carts, even outdoor furniture, some of it sold under private labels, through retailers like Sears. Mario renamed the company Radio Flyer, cementing forever the identity the world already knew it by. And in 1997, the torch passed again, to Mario's son, Robert Pasin, Antonio's grandson. Robert would eventually give himself the title Chief Wagon Officer, which sounds like a joke until you realize how seriously he meant it. By the time Robert took the reins, Radio Flyer had survived a depression, a world war, and 60 years of American childhood. It had never gone public. It had never taken on a corporate parent. It was, by any definition, a genuine only-in-America success story, which is exactly what makes what happened next so quietly devastating. Here's the uncomfortable truth about the American manufacturing economy at the turn of the millennium. It didn't matter how beloved your product was. It mattered what it cost to bend a piece of steel. By the early 2000s, Radio Flyer was still manufacturing its classic steel wagons at that same Chicago plant, the descendant of the very facility Antonio Pasin had built decades before. But the arithmetic of that plant had stopped making sense. American steel prices were climbing. American labor, appropriately, cost more than labor overseas, and the retail world Radio Flyer sold into had changed completely. This was the era of the big box store, of a consumer who had been trained, slowly and permanently, to expect the cost of goods to keep going down, year after year, no matter what it took to make that happen. Radio Flyer wasn't alone. It was living through the same current that was pulling apart dozens of other American manufacturers, some famous, most of them not, whose names didn't survive long enough to become nostalgia. Tricycles, scooters, most of Radio Flyer's other products had already shifted their production to China. The Wagon, the classic, steel, red wagon, was one of the last holdouts, the flagship, the thing people actually meant when they said Radio Flyer. And in March of 2004, the company made the announcement that a lot of people in Chicago had probably seen coming and dreaded anyway. Radio Flyer would close its Chicago manufacturing plant. Production of the metal wagons, 87 years of it, would move to China. Nearly half of the plant's 90 employees would lose their jobs. 90 employees, Let that number sit for a second, because it tells you something important. This wasn't a story about thousands of laid-off auto workers, the kind of mass casualty deindustrialization event that makes national news for weeks. This was small, quiet, 90 people, half of them gone, in a plant most Americans had never heard of, making a product most Americans assumed had always been made somewhere in China anyway. That quietness is exactly what makes it haunting. Robert Pasin, to his credit, didn't hide from the decision. He explained that the Chicago plant had simply become too expensive to keep running. And when reporters asked whether this would damage the brand's identity, whether Radio Flyer could survive without actually being built in America, he gave an answer that I think about a lot. "We're still a Chicago company," he told one reporter. "We're still a Chicago brand." It's a true statement. The headquarters stayed. The design team stayed. The Pasin family stayed. But notice the sleight of hand in that sentence, because it's not really an answer to the question that was asked. Nobody was asking whether the company's mailing address would still say Chicago. They were asking whether the wagon itself, the object, the steel, the thing a kid actually holds on to, would still be American. And the honest answer to that question was no. Now here's where this story splits from almost every other one I've told you about on this channel. Because Radio Flyer didn't die. It didn't get bought by a private equity firm and stripped for parts. It didn't get run into the ground by an outside CEO chasing quarterly numbers with no connection to the brand's history. The Pasin family never sold. They never went public. They're still, as of today, the only family that has ever owned this company. By almost every financial measure, moving production overseas worked. Radio Flyer wagons stayed affordable. The company stayed profitable. It diversified tricycles, scooters, ride-on toys, even a build-your-own wagon you can order online with a canopy and padded seats and your kid's name engraved on the side. Robert Pasin dragged a 100-year-old company into the 21st century, and by most business school metrics, he did it well. So where's the tragedy? I think the tragedy isn't in the balance sheet. It's in the gap between what the brand still promises and what it can no longer deliver. Every Radio Flyer wagon still carries the emotional weight of that founding story. The immigrant cabinet maker, the one-room workshop, the assembly line that kept running through the Depression, the Blitz cans that helped win a war. That story is Chicago, through and through. It's steel and sweat, and a specific American neighborhood. And the company still sells that story, hard, in every bit of marketing copy, because it's an extraordinary story, and it happens to be entirely true. But the object itself, the actual wagon in the box, was made somewhere the story never happened. Made by workers who have no connection to Antonio Pasin, or Belmont Cragen, or any of it. The story and the steel got separated, and the company kept selling both, as if they were still the same thing. Is that dishonest? I don't think that's the right word. I think it's just modern. It's what almost every legacy American brand has had to do to survive contact with a global economy that stopped rewarding the thing Antonio Pasin was actually good at, which was making something with his hands, in a room, in Chicago. The plant that closed in 2004 employed 90 people. It's easy to look at a number that small and decide it doesn't matter. But multiply that story by every small manufacturer that made the same call, for the same reasons, in the same decade, and you start to understand how a country loses its manufacturing base one unremarkable, financially rational decision at a time. Nobody sets out to hollow out an industrial economy. It just happens, plant by plant, 90 jobs at a time, until one day you look up and the wagon your grandfather gave you says something on the bottom that the new ones don't. Radio Flyer survived by doing exactly what it had to do. And that's precisely what makes it such a strange kind of casualty. Not of greed, not of mismanagement, but of an economic gravity that not even a beloved, family-run, financially disciplined company could resist forever. So what do we do with a story like this? One with no villain, no collapse, no dramatic courtroom ending. I think we sit with the discomfort of it, because most of the stories in this genre, the ones about private equity vultures and asset-stripping CEOs, let us off the hook a little. They give us someone to be angry at, a name, a face, a decision we can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Radio Flyer doesn't give us that. Radio Flyer gives us a family that loved what they built, that fought as hard as anyone could to keep it alive, and that still had to make a call that severed the company from the very thing that made it special in the first place. There's no villain here, just a market that stopped valuing what a Chicago factory floor used to be worth. And maybe that's the more honest lesson. Maybe the slow death of American manufacturing wasn't always a crime. Sometimes it was just math. Steel prices, labor costs, retail margins, 100 small defensible decisions that add up to something that feels, from a distance, like a tragedy, even when nobody involved was acting in bad faith. The wagon in my grandfather's garage still works, mostly. The wheels stick a little. The paint is gone in patches down to bare metal. But it was built by someone, in a specific place, at a specific moment in this country's history, and you can feel that when you pick it up. There's a weight to it that I don't think the new ones have, not because the new ones are poorly made, they're not, but because the story and the object used to be the same thing, and now they're not. Antonio Pasin died in 1990, at 93 years old, having built something that outlasted the Depression, a world war, and every recession in between. I don't know what he would have made of the decision his grandson had to make in 2004. I'd like to think he'd have understood it. He was, after all, an immigrant who came to this country with nothing but a set of hands and a willingness to adapt. Maybe that instinct, to bend rather than break, is the truest thing Radio Flyer ever inherited from him. The wagon still says Chicago on the box. It just doesn't say it on the steel anymore. And somewhere, in a driveway, in a suburb, a kid is about to pull that wagon down the sidewalk and turn it into a spaceship, or a stagecoach, or whatever a red wagon becomes in a child's head when the sun is out and there's nowhere in particular to be. He'll never know the difference. Maybe that's the whole point.